There is a phone number in a small farming town that almost nobody can get through on anymore. Not because it's disconnected, because it's too busy. The man who answers it, when he answers it at all, has to say the same sentence to almost everyone who calls. You're on the list. Right now, that means about 2 years. 2 years for a product that 6 years ago didn't exist. Made from something that 6 years ago nobody wanted. Something that once sat in a collapsing lot behind a shuttered factory, 40 tons of it, rotting in the open air, waiting for someone to pay to haul it away. Nobody wanted to pay that price, except one farmer who didn't see waste. He saw a question. This is the story of how he answered it. The factory had been there longer than most people in town could remember not being there. 3 generations had punched a clock inside its walls. It processed raw material into components nobody outside the industry thought about. The kind of unglamorous manufacturing that keeps a small town's lights on without ever making headlines. For decades, it worked. The trucks came in loaded, the trucks went out loaded, and the diner down the road filled up every day at noon with workers in the same steel-toed boots. Then, slowly, it stopped working. Cheaper competitors overseas, rising costs, equipment that needed replacing but never got replaced, because replacing it meant admitting the math no longer worked. Anyone who'd spent time in the break room could see it coming, the way you can see weather coming before the forecast confirms it. Shifts got cut. Then a whole line got shut down. Then came the meeting nobody wanted to attend, where a man in a suit nobody recognized explained in careful language that operations would be suspended indefinitely. Indefinitely turned out to mean forever. The gates closed on a Friday. By Monday, the parking lot was empty except for a few cars nobody had come back for. And behind the main building, in a fenced-off lot that used to be monitored and maintained, something else was left behind. Something the departing owners didn't want to deal with, didn't want to pay to remove, and eventually just walked away from. 40 tons of it. It wasn't dramatic to look at. No toxic green sludge, no smoke, nothing from a movie. Just heap after heap of dense, coarse, unglamorous industrial byproduct. The leftover material stripped away during processing, dumped and forgotten because it had never been anyone's job to figure out what to do with it. It clumped in some places, crumbled in others. It didn't burn easily, didn't compost, didn't break down the way anyone expected it to. Rain didn't wash it away. Wind didn't scatter it. It just sat there. The disposal company that finally got called in quoted a price to haul it off that made the county wince. Landfill fees, transport costs, the sheer tonnage. Nobody in local government wanted to write that check for material that served no purpose. So, for a long while, it did the only thing waste knows how to do. It waited. 12 miles down the county road, a farmer named Walter Hardin was doing the same thing, in a different way. Walter was 53, broad-shouldered, slow-spoken, the kind of man who measured twice and still checked a third time out of habit. He had a way of going quiet when he was thinking something through, long enough that people who didn't know him assumed he hadn't heard the question. He had, and he was usually about to answer it better for the wait. He'd inherited the farm from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before him. It sat on land that had fed 3 generations of Hardins, and every fence post, every drainage ditch, every worn patch on the barn floor carried some piece of that history. His father used to tell him back when Walter was young enough to think it was just something fathers say. Don't judge a thing by what it's for. Judge it by what it could be for. His father had said it about a broken plow blade once, reforged into a hinge that outlasted the barn door it was built for. Walter had never forgotten it. It had become, without him ever announcing it, the rule he ran his whole life by. He wasn't chasing anything new. New wasn't reliable, and reliable was what kept the operation alive. But reliable had gotten harder. Input costs kept climbing. The margins on his usual crops kept shrinking. 2 years running, the harvest had come in, decent, but never enough to get ahead of what he owed. Equipment loans, land taxes, a mortgage on ground that had never carried one in his father's lifetime. He'd started doing the quiet arithmetic that a lot of small farmers do late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on and his wife already asleep, running numbers that kept landing in the same uncomfortable place. If the next 2 seasons went the way the last 2 had, the farm his grandfather cleared by hand might not stay in the family, not through any single disaster, just through the slow erosion of margins too thin to survive another bad year. That wasn't a thought Walter said out loud, not even to his wife, not yet. But it sat behind everything he did that season, the way a low hum sits under a quiet room. He wasn't desperate, but he was paying attention, in the particular way people pay attention when the ground under them has started to feel less solid than it used to. So when he heard, secondhand, through someone who knew someone who'd worked at the plant, that there was a mountain of unclaimed material just sitting behind the old factory fence, free for the taking, if you were willing to deal with the hassle, he didn't think about it the way most people would have. Most people heard abandoned industrial waste and pictured a liability. Walter heard 40 tons of something and thought quietly, almost without meaning to, his father's old rules surfacing before he'd even finished the thought. There has to be something this can be used for. The first time he stood at the fence line and looked at the heaps, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt something closer to confusion. Up close, the material was strange, dense in the hand, gritty but not exactly like sand. It held its shape when compacted but broke apart unpredictably otherwise. It smelled faintly industrial, not unpleasant exactly, just unfamiliar. He crouched down, picked up a fistful, let it run through his fingers, and admitted to himself that he had no idea what he was looking at. He didn't load up a truck that day. He filled the bed of an old pickup with maybe 1/10 of what it could carry, enough to experiment with, not enough to commit to, enough to ask a question without pretending he already knew the answer. Driving it back to the farm, he had no plan, just curiosity and the stubborn, practical instinct his father had handed him at a workbench decades earlier. Don't throw away something until you know for certain it's worthless. If you've ever seen someone else dismiss a thing before, anyone had bothered to understand it, you already know the feeling Walter had standing at that fence line. Stay with this one. It's going somewhere worth watching. What followed was not a montage of quick success. It was months of failure, most of it unglamorous, some of it genuinely discouraging, and one stretch that nearly ended the whole thing. He tried mixing the material into soil amendments first, since that was the world he knew best. It didn't take. Whatever he added it to either resisted binding with it or reacted badly, turning brittle or waterlogged depending on the ratio. One batch, left out during a wet week, developed a smell strong enough that his wife told him, not gently, to move his experiment out of the barn. He tried compressing it into blocks, thinking there might be some structural use. The first attempts crumbled under their own weight before they'd even finished curing. The second batch held together slightly better but looked, in his own words to a neighbor, like something you'd be embarrassed to hand somebody. Word got around, the way it does in a small town. A few people who saw the piles behind his equipment shed assumed he'd lost a bit of sense. Nobody said it to his face exactly, But he heard the tone in the questions. What are you doing with that stuff anyway? Then came the setback that almost finished it. Walter had spent nearly 3 weeks refining a batch he genuinely believed might work, his best process yet, built around a curing method he'd been adjusting for a month. He'd sunk what little spare cash he had into a second-hand mixer to process it properly, a purchase his wife had quietly worried about before agreeing to it. He ran the full batch, let it cure the way his notes told him to, and came out to the shed one morning to find the entire thing had failed overnight. A humidity swing he hadn't accounted for had crept into the curing space and undone 3 weeks of work in a single night. Not a partial failure. All of it. Cracked, warped, unusable. $40 of material and 3 weeks of labor sitting in the shed like a verdict. He stood there a long time that morning, not saying anything. That was the day he came closest to hauling the whole project back to the factory lot and calling it finished. He'd already lost time he didn't have to spare, and the farm's real work, the work that actually paid the bills, was waiting on him. He told his wife that night at the same kitchen table where he'd been running the numbers all season that maybe it was time to let it go. She didn't tell him what to do. She just asked him one question. What would his father have said about a batch that failed once? Walter didn't answer that night, but he didn't haul the material back to the factory lot either. If you've ever kept going on something after everyone would have understood if you'd quit, this next part is for you. And if that kind of story is the kind you come back for, this is a good moment to subscribe before we get to what finally turned it around. He rebuilt the curing space first, sealed it properly this time, controlled for the humidity that had ruined him. Then he went back to the beginning of his notes, checking every failed batch for a detail he might have missed the first time through. One detail kept surfacing that he hadn't paid enough attention to. Whatever this material was, when it was processed a certain way, it held onto temperature differently than anything else he'd worked with, staying cool in the heat of the afternoon far longer than it should have, and holding warmth overnight longer than expected too. That detail had nagged at him for weeks before the failed batch. Now, rebuilding from nothing, it was the only thread he had left to pull. He didn't shout. He didn't run inside to tell anyone. He just sat with it for a few days, testing it again under different conditions, half expecting the effect to disappear the way so many of his earlier promising signs had. It didn't disappear. It held. What Walter was building still didn't have a name yet, not even in his own head. He called it the process when his wife asked, and the material when a neighbor did. He wasn't being secretive. He genuinely didn't know yet what it was going to become. The pattern, though, wouldn't let him alone. The material, properly processed and combined with a simple binding method he'd stumbled into through trial and error, was doing something with temperature that nothing else he knew of did. Not for the cost, not from a source that had once been considered garbage. He built a small test structure with it, modest, unremarkable to anyone passing by, and tracked the internal temperature against a comparable structure built the conventional way, through a stretch of brutal summer heat and then into the first cold snap of fall. The numbers held. He still didn't tell anyone he'd cracked something. He just quietly kept refining the process, batch after batch, adjusting ratios, adjusting cure time, until what came out of his shed stopped looking like an experiment and started looking like a product. By the time he was done, what Walter was producing had a shape you could hold in your hands. Solid, rigid panels, cut to standard building dimensions, light enough for one person to carry, but dense enough to hold their form under pressure. Stacked on a pallet, they looked almost unremarkable until you understood what they were made of and what they could do once they were built into a wall. The first person to actually use them was a neighbor, half out of curiosity and half out of pity, who needed to insulate a small outbuilding on a tight budget. He offered Walter's strange panels more as a favor than a vote of confidence. They worked better than either of them expected. The neighbor mentioned it almost as an aside to another farmer at the feed store. That farmer, skeptical but curious, asked for a batch of his own. Then a small local contractor heard about it and wanted enough for a project. Then someone building a modest workshop asked if it could be delivered before the weekend. There was no launch, no announcement. Just one person telling another. The way trust moves through a small community, slowly and then all at once. Within a year, what had started as a curiosity a few neighbors indulged had become something Walter could no longer keep up with, using the equipment and process he'd built by hand. Calls started coming from outside the county, then outside the state. He raised prices cautiously, assuming demand would settle. It didn't. He brought on help to keep pace with orders. Still didn't catch up. The waiting period crept up gradually, the way debt does. A few days at first, forgivable. Then a few weeks, apologized for. Then months, explained patiently to frustrated customers. Then, without anyone quite marking the exact day it happened, a year. Then close to 2. The man who once stood at a fence line wondering what 40 tons of unwanted industrial leftovers might possibly be good for now, had a list of names longer than he could process in the time most businesses take to fill a single order. A list of people willing to wait 2 full years for panels made from what a factory had simply left behind to rot. The farm his grandfather cleared by hand is still standing, still in the family. The mortgage that once kept Walter up at that kitchen table is gone. The factory building still stands, mostly empty, a little more weathered each year. Nobody drives past it thinking about what used to sit in the lot behind it. But that material didn't disappear. It just changed hands, changed form, changed meaning. The 40 tons nobody wanted became the reason people wait 2 years for something they do. Nothing about the material itself ever changed. What changed was the question one man was willing to ask about it, and the years he was willing to spend answering that question, one failed batch at a time, until failure finally ran out of things to teach him. Value was never missing from that pile behind the fence. It was just waiting for someone patient enough to find it. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, ordinary people, real setbacks, patience that actually pays off, there are more like it here. Like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe if you want to keep finding them.